So welcome everybody to the Harvard Renaissance Colloquium. I see a lot of familiar faces and a couple of new ones, and I'm so excited to have all of you here for this very special event. With us today is Jeffrey R. Wilson and Maria Devlin McNair. Maria received her PhD from Harvard University in 2017. Since then, she has taught at St. Louis University High School, worked for the educational company VitCharts, and served as a writer and producer for the podcast Ministry of Ideas, hosted at the Harvard Divinity School. She is currently a course creator and producer for Shakespeare for All, an online audio series that offers an engaging, accessible introduction to Shakespeare's works through interviews and performances from top Shakespearean scholars and performers. Jeffrey R. Wilson is a faculty member in the writing program at Harvard University, where he teaches Why Shakespeare of the university's first-year writing course. He is the author of 2 books, Shakespeare and Trump and Shakespeare and Game of Thrones. His work has appeared in journals such as Modern Language Quarterly, Genre, and College Literature, and has been featured in public venues including National Public Radio, Literary Hub, Socorro Public Square, and MLA's Profession. Thank you so much, Maria and Jeff, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Karina. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and everyone. So we wanted to make this a presentation that's oriented towards all of you. So we wanted to start by asking you to think about your own work and how it might surface in a public humanities project. So we're going to go through some of the trials and errors of our own sort of careers over the next 40 minutes, thinking about possibilities for bringing your public humanities projects to life. Then we'll move briefly into breakout rooms to strategize some possible pathways towards this and come back together as a group for questions, conversations about our experiences, and your public humanities plans. And at that point, we've prepared a little Google Doc tip sheet that we can look at and add to sort of catalog our conversation. So I will hand it over to Jeff.
So Salina, Kansas, 1993. I'm in 7th grade and kids all across town are walking out of school and marching down Main Street on City Hall in protest of local government's failure to fund public schools. In the United States, 40 years of defunding public education has cultural consequences. 20 years of defunding the humanities has consequences. American citizens have received less training in the arts of interpretation at a time when the internet gives us an information overload every single day. So we start with public humanities returns education to the people that government has taken it away from. So 3 problems we can begin with. So the social problem is that education in general and the humanities in particular have lost ground in the United States over the past 40 years, and one consequence has been decreased quality of life. The professional problem is that academia's response to the social problem, the rise of the public humanities, draws upon and perpetuates traditions of elitism and exclusion. And the practical problem is that the junior academics best positioned to fix the professional problem aren't being trained to do public humanities and don't have any professional incentives to do them.
So we want to start thinking about these kinds of questions today. What does it take to launch a public humanities project? What are the skills I should start with? What does the process for these projects look like? How do I find an audience? What advice might practitioners have as a way of thinking, sort of from the ground up, how to get towards a place where we can start addressing those big problems that Jeff has outlined? So my path towards the public humanities was a little bit different than it might look for some of you. We're thinking about how, from a university context, as a professor, we might engage with some of these projects. So I wanted to be upfront about this for myself from the get-go. A primary motivation for me was finding an intellectual life, primarily from potentially outside the university. I got married right away after graduate school. I knew I was moving to a specific place. We knew we wanted to have children right away, and tenure track jobs are hard to find in any case. So I thought, I might want to be looking for something outside of the university, and public humanities attracted me for a number of reasons. So first, presenting my research to general audiences and making it sort of fun and accessible, I thought would be good training for high school teaching, which I was very attracted to. I did end up teaching for a year at a prep school, and I think one reason they hired me was because I had this background in public humanities work. So if anyone wants to discuss that track, I'm happy to. And more broadly, I thought if I have a full-time job outside academia, whether that's high school teaching or parenting, and I only have a small amount of time for academic work, I want that work to have impact. I want to be able to reach more people and reach them in a different kind of way than I could if I were, just writing a journal article every 2 years. Now, way back when, before I had any thought of going to graduate school or being a Shakespeare scholar, I had a professor who, maybe it sounds like a cliche, but made me fall in love with Shakespeare's plays. And I came out of that course feeling like I understood Shakespeare enough to keep going back to it for the rest of my life and learning more, and also like I couldn't wait to keep going back. And I thought, if I can find a way to give other people just a kind of sense of this, I understand this and I love this, that's something valuable that I can give to people. And that's my way of kind of paying it forward for all the people who taught me so generously and wonderfully, some of whom are here today. And that's my very sort of personal, particular path towards public humanities work. But I think we all identify with the sense that we love literature. It brings us joy, it brings us connection to other people, and it brings us meaning and helps us understand things. I want to help, my daughter to find a way to see and understand the world through literature. I want to help other people do that. And I think public humanities work is very much oriented towards that. It helps you look at stories and at life together and see more and see better. And that was my sort of general aim here.
Hi, my name is Jeff, and I'm an alcoholic. I wrote a little piece about this called Sober for 20 Under 40. So I had some dark days in my teen years, and I wrote about those in a piece called Hamlet is a Suicide Text. It's time to teach it like one. So I begin with these really personal experiences because public humanities can bring our academic work back to the experiences and the questions that brought us to literary studies in the first place. After a not very impressive high school career, I started higher education at a community college out in California. I then moved up to San Diego State for a bachelor's degree, and that's where I fell in love with Milton's poetry. And I always thought I was going to be a Miltonist. So when I moved up the road to University of California at Irvine, started teaching writing courses. One of my favorite ways to teach close reading was by looking at the first epic simile in Paradise Lost. So this is the one about the seafarer who anchors his skiff to a whale, thinking that it's an island, and then the whale wakes up and goes plunging down, dragging the sailor along. What I didn't expect was that that would form the foundation for an essay I wrote, unprovocatively titled, Trump is Satan. Public humanities allows you to find the personal and the political in the academic work that you do. So when this piece originally came out, the photo here was photoshopped to give Trump beady red eyes and red horns that were drawn onto it. And I was livid because that really goes against the tone of the piece that I was trying to go for. I also remember the editor trying to kind of push me far toward being provocative and being controversial in ways that I wasn't comfortable with. And then the piece comes out and he tweets out something like, liberal Harvard professor says Trump is Satan. So we can think about some of these dynamics that are in play here. It reminds me of the time that I framed an essay by saying we should stop making character comparisons between Trump and Shakespearean characters. And then the New York Daily News titled the piece, "Which of Shakespeare's tragic heroes is Donald Trump?" During grad school, I met my wife and we wanted to wait to start having kids until after I'd filed my dissertation. We missed the mark by about 6 months. And so I had to write the final 40 pages of my dissertation on my phone with a screaming child in one hand. And that evolved into I would put him in a stroller and we would go for these epic 3-hour walks in Southern California where I would dictate into my phone. And that's pretty much the only way that I can write now. I can't sit down kind of chained at a desk. I have to be up kind of moving around, and the movement in my body gets the movement in my ideas going. So I wrote about this in my very first public piece from 2015 called Why I Write in My Mobile Phone. And one of the things I didn't expect from doing public work is people creating art based on your ideas and how amazingly cool that is. But from that experience, I learned the single most important thing for me about public writing: don't make an argument, tell a story. I got my PhD in 2012 for a dissertation about Shakespeare, not Milton. I had no luck on the job market for a couple of years in a row, but I did get hired to teach writing classes in, of all places, a Department of Criminal Justice. So my experience teaching in that department led to an article called Shakespeare and Criminology. So doing academic work can create opportunities for public humanities. One day I get an email from Shankar Vedantam, the social science correspondent at NPR, who happens to be a big theater nut. And he says he's developing a podcast that will marry the humanities and the social sciences, and asks if I'd like to talk about Shakespeare and criminology for the pilot episode. So that conversation that we recorded in 2015 ended up thinking about what's called broken windows policing in light of the attempts at law enforcement reform in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure.
Today, we're going to take a look at one of Shakespeare's most interesting plays and its intersections with an important idea from social science research. If you live in Boston or New York or Los Angeles, in fact, many cities across the country, the theory of broken windows policing has touched your life. Today, we're going to tell you about new research into this theory, and we'll see how Shakespeare, writing 400 years ago, anticipated what those experiments and studies are finding today.
So one of the takeaways for me was that public humanities comes in addition to, not in place of, the academic work that we do. And the strength of our public humanities depends upon the strength of the academic work that stands behind it.
So building on some of the points that Jeff has given, I was thinking about them as I was looking back to how I got started in my public humanities work. I would say that if you're thinking you might like to get into this kind of work later, it's good to start thinking about it now, keeping yourself open to possible topics and opportunities and connections. When I was in graduate school, I kind of had a rule of thumb that if someone asks you to do something, you should say yes. So when Stephen mentioned to me, Professor Greenblatt, the possibility of helping with these online courses he was creating for Harvard X called Shakespeare's World, yes, I would love to help do that. And that was my first foray into online education. And we're collaborating on Shakespeare for All. And then in graduate school, I also went to a conference on something that wasn't my field of study. It was Catholic literature. But I met an editor who invited me to contribute some pieces to a journal that he wrote. He does for non-academic audiences. So I wrote my first sort of public pieces there. And my takeaways from these experiences were that the ingredients for public humanities are academic expertise plus sort of a wide cultural net. So as Jeff said, these pieces are only as good as the academic research behind them. I think you need to keep that in mind. Sometimes we use the metaphor of boiling something down or watering something down for a non-academic audience as though that means the same thing, but watering down means diluting. Boiling down means intensifying the original flavor of what you first put in. So if you want good flavors coming out, you have to put good flavors going in. You have to put that work in. So you want the good academic background, but you also want a sense of how to connect what's important in your sort of narrower fields to a larger phenomenon. With these pieces that I wrote, I was trying to find ways to connect the phenomenon of humor and laughter in Dante and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight to Jane Austen and Emma and Robert Burns and Harry Potter and Sherlock Holmes and romantic comedies. And that's been sort of the approach I've tried to take, as you'll see in Game of Thrones. How can we use our scholarship to illuminate pop culture? And then the other ingredients are personal relationships and personal concerns. A lot of the projects will come from people that you know, and the way to make something exciting that other people will want to spend their time on is often, as Jeff said with his experience of writing, to start with something that was important and meaningful for you. It's not always, well, it can be, but it's in a different way than when we start with our academic papers. And I would say sort of let yourself go to that place when you're thinking about what these projects might start from.
So I had been applying for every job in New England for about 2 years, hadn't gotten a single interview. And then January 2014, I get a job in the Harvard College writing program. And as part of this, they want me to teach Hamlet every semester. And so every time I teach the play, I write a new essay about it. And doing so helps me kind of remember the process that my students are going through, moving from questions about the text to developing arguments to structuring essays. So the first of my essays on Hamlet gets published in 2015 in the leftist magazine Counterpunch. The thing I remember about this one is that I sent the essay in to the editor. I got an email back about an hour later that said, "This is great. It'll be up on the website this afternoon." And I thought, oh crap. I'm used to 9 months of revise and resubmit here. And so one of the things that I took away is that I had to learn this a few times, but don't send something out that you're not 100% confident with your name being on the website that afternoon behind. So as part of our Why Shakespeare course, we think about Shakespeare across the disciplines, thinking about using other disciplines to interpret Shakespeare, using Shakespeare to do work in other disciplines. And then in the heat of the 2016 US presidential election, Jill Bradbury down at Gallaudet University invites me to speak on Shakespeare across the disciplines. And I didn't know that a couple quick examples I threw out that afternoon would grow into chapter 2 of my book, Shakespeare and Trump. So the next year, my local public library in Lowell, Massachusetts invites me to talk about Shakespeare and Trump. Figuring out how to package my research for my mother-in-law was so helpful for future public humanities work. And, academics, we know a lot about the content that we study, but we've also got a lot to learn about how to present that content for people outside of the profession. So that evening, I told 5 stories that ended up becoming the 5 chapters in Shakespeare and Trump. And doing public humanities work will kind of figuring out how to package your research in ideas that are accessible and entertaining. It pays dividends for your academic work. So this book is written for folks that are outside of Shakespeare studies. And it's important to remember that public humanities is not for the scholars. Don't try to please the scholars when you do public humanities work. I don't try to please my retired firefighter father-in-law when I'm writing a scholarly article. I had to figure out how to do a book release party during lockdown. And here we can think about some of the ways to make a good online academic event, because that's public humanities too. Public humanities work isn't profitable financially, but it can be very rewarding for you emotionally, for your communities. And public humanities work is how many of the people in your support system, your friends and your families, can access and engage with the academic work that you do. The original conclusion to Shakespeare and Trump got cut out, and it became the standalone essay called Historicizing Presentism toward the creation of a journal of the public humanities. Happy to say there are exciting conversations that are ongoing. So what I like about that project is that as a peer-reviewed academic journal, it gives junior academics a professional reason to do public humanities. So the best way to save the humanities, I think, is to restructure the profession to incentivize public humanities. Writing a book with some crossover appeal opens some doors for new public humanities opportunities. And that's important because open submissions is where good ideas go to die. I found an old checklist of places that I unsuccessfully submitted Shakespeare and Trump pieces to. They all said no. So it's important to build a network where we can kind of usher in good public humanities work into the world, because as Maria said, public humanities often come about through pre-existing relationships.
I'm really happy to have Jeff Wilson here, one of my former PhD students who's now teaching literature at Harvard University.
So I like to think start small, right? Do interviews for friends' blogs, for niche websites and hometown newspapers, and working in these lower stakes venues helps you get a feel for kind of what works and what doesn't. You don't want to be figuring that out during a nationally televised interview. And then you meet some new friends along the way, and then they invite you to do things.
Shakespeare might have predicted all of 2020. We knew the murder hornets were coming next.
Yeah, 2020 is the worst. 2020 is like the second half of Julius Caesar. There's no optimism.
So some guy here is drawing this cartoon of himself in the bathtub listening to our podcast. I really don't know how to feel about this one, but I will say that public humanities work leads to some, memorable moments of human interaction. And sometimes those are amazing and life-affirming. Sometimes those are bizarre and hilarious. Sometimes they're quite unsettling and unfortunate. So it's December 2020, and we had a COVID exposure in our family. And so I'm isolating from my family up in what we come to call my fortress of solitude. It was final week of the semester. Students were writing essays. I had wall-to-wall meetings. I get an email from Peter Baker at the New York Times asking if I can comment for a story he's working on. I'm so stressed out and exhausted, but I say I've got a brief window between student meetings between 2 and 2:15 that afternoon if he wants to stop by my Zoom office hours, which is an absurd thing to say to a really respected national journalist. I did no prep for this interview, and I tossed out what I thought was a kind of a throwaway line calling Trump's December classic Act 5 behavior, which seemed to give folks a good way of understanding the situation. So what I love about this one is that it illustrates why I think we do public humanities work, because the terms of literary studies can help us interpret life. Peter Baker's a guest on Alex Witt's MSNBC show, and then Alex Witt invites me on to come on our show. I'm really not someone who's comfortable in the spotlight, but I kind of challenged myself to rise to the occasion because there was an important point that I wanted to make. Second, I'll speak to Joe Biden. If you want to restore the soul of America, start funding those things that help us think and talk with each other. Public schools, cultural organizations, the arts and humanities, that is where America is going to be processing the trauma of these Trump years. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Jeff. So I just wanted to give a sort of similar sense of what my pathway looked like here and what are some of the takeaways that I found too. So my first big project was working for Ministry of Ideas. I got connected to that through Zachary Davis, who I met while working at Harvard X. That led to more kind of spin-off projects, writing for the Boston Globe, talking on other podcasts, working on a new project now with Zach called Illuminations. And my big takeaways from Ministry of Ideas, which is a podcast that kind of does history of ideas, trying to make them exciting and accessible, is that you can find answers to a lot of your questions. What do I write about? What do I include? What do I leave out? What's my voice like? Where do I begin? If you keep the audience as your focus, think about the experience the audience is having, and that will guide your decisions as a writer. So obviously, it doesn't matter what you're saying if no one's sticking around to hear you. And they have to stick around voluntarily. This isn't a research paper. It's not their field. They need to want to listen. So you need to make the experience pleasurable by focusing on aesthetics. And sometimes that's very literally like the art on your website or the sound design of your podcast. We did an episode on children's literature and we used clips from films. And when I heard the Lord of the Rings music swelling in and Gandalf saying, all we have to decide is what to do with the time that's given us, then I got sort of goosebumps. And I felt like, I hope this is happening for other people too. But the aesthetic experience is also about the storytelling style. So as Jeff said, the most important thing is to tell a story. It's going to be a different approach than you would use for a lot of academic work where the introduction has to kind of give away the surprise, right? It gives the answer up front. You start with an engaging question, and then you have to bring the audience along gradually as you illuminate the answer piece by piece. So we did an episode on Shakespeare, Hamilton, and canons. We started by saying canons have been criticized as instruments of exclusion. Could they actually be the pathways to inclusion? How could that work? Well, you're going to have to wait until the last bit of the episode to find out. And then once you've got the audience hopefully wanting to hear what you have to say, what do I have that's worth hearing? What's exciting? What will make an impact? And a lot of that will come from this question and answer structure. And it needs to be big. And that's something that we're not always comfortable with. We feel like we need the immediate evidence to back up everything we have to say. And you can get to truthful generalizations by putting in that work, but then you have to be comfortable saying them. So our children's literature podcast started out by asking, does children's literature actually save adults? We ended by saying children's books satisfy an innate human need. They challenge us to be better. It's a big claim, but if it's true, it's something important. And you want to give the audience that sense that, yeah, I came here to experience something important and I got it. And you'll need to get to a place where you're comfortable doing that and realizing that your work can help you make those statements true. Along with narrative, of course, you want to connect with what's happening in people's lives, like Shakespeare to, December 2020. We looked in our children's literature episode at how the Parkland activists in the Never Again movement were inspired by Harry Potter. And then thinking about, okay, if I have this thing the audience wants to learn, how do I make it easy for them to learn? That's all about style. And style has to be a priority as important as anything else that you're doing, the ideas, the research. And the priority within style is clarity. Steven Pinker wrote this great piece called Why Academic Writing Stinks and How to Fix It. And he identifies the major reason why academics write unclear prose or prose people outside their field can't follow. And he says it's because of a cognitive blind spot called the curse of knowledge, the difficulty in imagining what it is like for someone else not to know something that you know. Most scholars, it doesn't occur to them that their readers don't know what they know. So you start by putting yourself in the audience's place, saying, if I were coming to this cold, how would this strike me? What background information do I need? If I heard this sentence, what would I understand and what would I miss? And that's a big help in shaping your style. And the other thing I would say that is, once I started hearing our narrator reading my work out loud in my head as I was composing, that I think really helped enhance the stylistic clarity. Next thing, when we're trying to attract English concentrators, we sometimes toss around statements like, English teaches you transferable critical reading and writing skills. The nice thing about that is it's actually true. Once you start working with people who aren't English majors, you realize that not everyone has those skills at the same level and they really do transfer to other areas. But when you transfer, you have to realize that even if you are not at a professor level expertise in that other topic, your research training has enabled you to become the expert you need to be for purposes of this work. And then finally, as Jeff said, jobs lead to jobs, or as our friend Peter Baelish would put it, titles do seem to breed titles.
So I just want to highlight a couple ongoing projects here. And one is what I'm calling an oral history of public Shakespeare. Apologies if some of you are seeing yourselves right now. So this collects interviews with both practitioners and analysts who are doing public facing Shakespeare work. And the central argument is that We might think of early modern theater as what scholars now call public engagement. Shakespeare and his contemporaries took sources and ideas from the academia of their time, transformed them around into something accessible for an audience outside of academia, and created a space for people to think about their lives and times in light of history and creative expression. In 2018, I started a classroom assignment asking students to take their 10-page, heavily footnoted research papers and turn them into public essays written with fire and joy. So we've had 9 of these published so far, and the writing program's doing a little featurette on this assignment.
Shakespeare, staple of literature classes worldwide. Could a scrappy band of first-year writing students add to the public discourse about the bard?
The essays that these first-year college students have written in our Why Shakespeare course are just so good. They deserve to have a life beyond our class, and that's kind of the idea behind our final session, which is a public writing workshop. How did you shift from academic to public writing?
To be told, here are the reins, you can be the originator of information.
Compressing an essay that, I spent so long writing.
Trying to make it a bit more accessible to the public.
I don't know if intimidated is the right word.
I tried to sort of view it as a conversation with someone from my hometown.
No, intimidated is actually a pretty good word.
What were some of the questions that were animating your essay?
I do believe Shakespeare is not of an age, but for all time.
If it's like for everybody, why is this so weird for me to see it?
How does your own story connect up with your topic?
Mine was all about classical music. There was this inherent musicality to Shakespeare that I wanted to explore a little bit more.
My essay ended up examining marriage culture in India, how this was portrayed in Bollywood adaptations of Romeo and Juliet.
Being surrounded by my family reinforced the ideas that I was trying to get across. I'm writing about their situation.
There was like a pretty rich story to be told about his almost overbearing presence in a lot of African syllabi and curricula.
What is the role of art in helping people understand certain social and political issues?
What sorts of reactions did you get?
Yeah, I sent it to my mom, the inspirational helicopter parent.
I sent it to my sister, and she caught a typo.
The whole family being proud that I had this opportunity to share my ideas, and especially my mother, very, very, very proud.
Something that was really big and just super exciting for me was just seeing the response of, I guess, the larger Shakespeare community.
How did this experience change you?
There's my name on the homepage of this website. I see this article. It's there. It's actually there.
My thinking about writing changed.
How to deal with feedback, looking for sharp details, just changed my whole college experience.
I'm definitely going to try and pursue writing in whatever forum that I can. I definitely want to go full throttle into the humanities.
Jeff, that is so cool, and I will be gratified beyond expression if this course that we're working on can help inspire some of those kinds of projects from people learning about Shakespeare, some of them maybe for the first time. That's the idea behind Shakespeare for All, this project I'm working on now. It's a set of online audio courses designed to make Shakespeare accessible and enjoyable for an audience with no background in his works. So it speaks very much to the whole reason I wanted to do Public Humanities project. Same ingredients going into this: academic expertise, personal relationships, and then a background in public humanities as its own sort of area of expertise. And I thought I would just share a little bit of a key sort of learning moment from this. But first I would want to say that I couldn't have produced this course on my own. I do have a platform. I have funding from our parent company. We have a technical team that I found essential to allowing me to do this sort of on my own outside the university, but we can talk about resources to use if you want to do these kinds of projects more independently. So starting off, our first play course to be produced was on Hamlet, and this was a big deal. Hopefully it would get people excited about the next courses, but I started off in kind of a panic because I thought at first that we'd gotten the wrong material. So I always thought, what's important for people to know about Hamlet? Well, we all know, this is the play where Shakespeare invents interiority. He invents thinking on the stage. He invents the human, all those kinds of things. So I started off, I wrote the course with this framework, really focused on that kind of psychological, approach to the play. And then we did our interview with our featured scholar, the person who's going to supply all the material for this framework. And she didn't talk about any of those things. She had this whole other body of material about Hamlet. She's from Poland. She looked at it from the perspective of being a global play connected to continental Europe. She saw it as a political play, the succession crisis in England and Hamlet, and the succession crisis in Norway and Denmark connected to Fornbras. It was wonderful, but it wasn't my frame. And it sounds like a sort of small thing, but it sort of made my brain flip, realizing that public humanities isn't just about sort of reporting what's already been discussed and decided upon in kind of the halls of academia. And in this case, we were talking to this other scholar, but it was also gave me the idea that this course can also change the way that we typically approach Hamlet, or what we all know about Hamlet, or what we all think is important. Public humanities can make interventions as well as sort of just transmit what we all already know. So we redid the framework of the play to talk about it being a political, continental, global play. And Jeff, you can play our new clip from the opening.
He alludes to Troy, he alludes to ancient Rome, he alludes to contemporary states. The frame of reference in terms of history, in terms of literature, in terms of geography is extraordinarily wide. If Shakespeare is a global author, Hamlet is a global play. Hi, I'm Paulina Hughes. I'm a professor of English literature at the University of Oxford, and I'm also a tutor and fellow in English at Jesus College, Oxford.
Welcome to Shakespeare for All. In this episode, we're speaking with Professor Paulina Hughes about Hamlet. Written around 1600 and based on an ancient Norse legend, Hamlet is still read, performed, and enjoyed all around the world.
Thank you. And then I'd say the other key moment with Hamlet was making me sort of wish I'd done my whole approach differently when I was in graduate school. Graduate school is a lot of, I would say, very exploitative reading. I know I want to talk about this moment in the play, I'll go reread the speech. For this course, I did a totally different way of prepping. I didn't really look at the texts until I had listened to the plays and watched them, like as many different productions as I could do. And this completely changed my ideas sometimes about what was important in the play. In Hamlet, I hadn't really given the character of Claudius much thought. Right? Hamlet's the important one. But then I was so struck by how differently the Claudius, the character, could come across as someone I kind of despised in Kenneth Branagh's production, or someone I loved in David Tennant's production. I thought, wait, he should be the ruler of Denmark. And so what we ended up doing was I asked, in addition to having all the big Hamlet soliloquies in our course, I had someone record Claudius's opening speech, and then we had two professors come on and talk about it from two totally different points of view, saying how you could interpret the speech to mean that Claudius is a very fragile, vulnerable ruler, or that he's a much better ruler than, old King Hamlet was. That was an angle I wouldn't really have, come across if I hadn't come at the plays from performance. I hope that can be, a bigger part of a conversation about academic work and public humanities work. And then this brings us to our Game of Thrones and Shakespeare collaboration.
So in our Why Shakespeare course, after Hamlet in Unit 1, and in our second unit, we asked students to read 3 texts together. We pick a Shakespearean text, we pick a theoretical text, and we pick a modern adaptation. So in 2016, we used Henry VI plays, and I appreciate the questionable judgment of assigning all 3 Henry VI plays to first-year students. And then we paired that with a Shakespeare Quarterly article called Attributing the Authorship of the Henry VI Plays by Word Adjacency, that is talking about Shakespeare, Marlowe, others who wrote which scenes. And then our modern adaptation was Game of Thrones. And so growing out of those classroom conversations, I write this book called Shakespeare and Game of Thrones. And what I love about this one is it's dedicated to the Why Shakespeare students, because it's scholarship for students and non-specialists. It aims to pose those big conceptual questions that so often appear in our classrooms, which are often ethical and political, and to respond to those with scholarly rigor.
And so our collaboration came from my mentioning to a friend that I was working on Game of Thrones and Shakespeare, and then the friend told me that Jeff was working on this book, and I knew Jeff from Harvard, so I reached out. We did an interview together. I read his book, and then this constellation of topics emerged in a really kind of lovely way. I started off with some ideas about the framework, and Jeff's ideas that influenced the questions I asked, and those questions that Jeff answered changed the framework that we started with, in particular, the way that Shakespeare and Game of Thrones look at disability, race, and gender. So I love, Jeff saying about the big ethical and political questions that shape these episodes. This came out of very personal places, like certainly for me, talks with friends after we had our Game of Thrones viewing parties. What did everybody fight about after we saw the episodes? Moments that kept me up at night, literally. My friend sent me this article about storytelling in Game of Thrones. I was brushing my teeth. It was 11 p.m. at night, and I just stood there for like 20 minutes with my toothbrush, like riveted to this article, being like, my life has changed from reading this, and it became a big part of our episodes. And then in the actual podcast series, it ended up becoming the questions of, why does history make a better story than stories do? Is it bad to be honorable? Is morality different for political leaders? Have we been doing Shakespeare all wrong all along? Why do we love watching violence? What's wrong with us as people? And what makes great art? Those big questions, right, that make us want to go towards this, but we don't always get to go to places that big and other kinds of work. And then we did some really, I think this became really sort of, for me, a highlight or exemplary public humanities project because of the collaboration. We had professors, scholars, actors, journalists, and fans. I had a friend who isn't an academic at all. He just loves reading about the history behind these things, and we interviewed him, and he gave such wonderful takes on this whole thing. We were really breaking boundaries between who's considered an expert or a non-expert, what's high culture, what's low culture, what's just personal, and what's appropriate professional sort of things to discuss. What linking classic literature to pop culture, and then using serious scholarship to illuminate the pop culture, and making this, I think, sort of accessible and exciting through the sound design, the music, and performance. So we can play a clip here.
Sound drums and trumpets, boldly and cheerfully. God and St. George, Richmond, and victory!
Shakespeare's depiction of a heroic Henry Tudor overcoming a demonic Richard III reflects a view of history called the Tudor Myth. The Tudor monarch Elizabeth I ruled England when Shakespeare wrote his history plays, and this was how the Tudors would have wanted to see their role in history, as the providentially destined victors in a cosmic battle of good against evil.
So in the course of telling these historical, societal tragedies, Shakespeare starts to identify generic form, and then he changes the generic form. And as soon as he's telling a historical romance, you start to get elements of fantasy in it with the conquest of good versus evil. Then Martin sees that the Tudor myth has elements of fantasy in it, and so it would be well suited to the genre conventions of fantasy literature. So it makes sense to bring in dragons and zombies and long-lost princes and princesses.
Martin saw how Shakespeare started to move medieval history towards literary fantasy by casting political struggle in this mythic spiritual mold. Then Martin took that same historical material and asked just how far he could push the fantasy elements.
If you look at a map, a medieval map of the world, at the edges of the map, there's areas that are either unexplored thus far, or haven't really been traveled to. And oftentimes you'll see this Latin phrase, hic sunt draconis, which means here be dragons. And it essentially entails that we don't know what's out here. There could be anything. It's dangerous, it's scary, but there's mythological creatures. There could be. And at the end of the day, he brought that to life. He said, well, what if at those edges of the map there actually were dragons?
So that brings our presentation portion to a close. We're going to go into breakout rooms now to discuss some of your ideas for public humanities projects, some questions you might like to discuss together, and then we'll regroup in about 5 minutes.